makers and market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone. It's Monday. Welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, Iran says the U.S. has directly entered the war and should await, quote, severe consequences. That's according to a statement from the country's army cited in local media. Now, this comes after President Trump claimed U.S. strikes over the weekend obliterated Iran's nuclear sites, significantly setting back the country's uranium enrichment capabilities. The vice president, J.D. Vance, says the attacks were focused solely on Tehran's nuclear capability.
No, Kristen, we're not at war with Iran. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program. And let me just say, Kristen, that we're incredibly grateful and proud of the American Air Force pilots who did an incredible job last night. The operation was really extraordinary.
Meanwhile, Iran says the U.S. attacks were a betrayal of diplomacy.
We were attacked in the midst of an ongoing diplomatic process. We were supposed to meet with Americans on 15 June to craft a very promising agreement for peaceful resolution of the issues fabricated over our peaceful nuclear program. It was a betrayal of diplomacy and an unprecedented blow to the foundation of international law and UN system.
Now, for more on this, we're joined by Jumana Versace, Horizon Middle East and Africa anchor. So, Jumana, how quickly and how could Iran retaliate?
That's the big question. What is certain is that they most likely will have to retaliate. They have an option to capitulate, i.e. surrender, or go down the route of retaliating. If you look at the language that has come out the last 24 hours, would suggest that they do want to somehow reciprocate to those U.S. strikes on the nuclear facilities. Now, they could go down the route of a targeted response, similar to what they did after the killing of Qasem Soleimani back in 2020, hitting a U.S. base in Iraq, but telegraphing it beforehand, not causing any fatalities. But they could go down the route of something more escalatory, i.e. targeting U.S. assets within the Gulf states, which would risk flaring up tensions with Gulf states as well, something that they may want to avoid. There's also been a lot of talk about the potential closure or blockades of the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian state TV saying yesterday that Parliament has approved that measure, but ultimately the decision will rest with the National Security Council. That would be very disruptive, not only for global trade, but also for Iranian oil exports as well. And then the other route that they could go down is firing up some of their proxies within the region, which of course, many of whom have been severely decapitated, a lot of their ammunitions severely diminished over the course of the last 12 months. So which really raises a question about, one, the appetite of these proxies to get involved, but also their capacity. And then finally, Francine, they could go down the route of potential cyber attacks or even igniting terrorism cells around the world as well.
Jumana, we're just getting a little bit of breaking news. Actually, Brent futures turning lower, so they were gaining as much as 5.7%, and now pretty much flat, even a little bit on the lower side. How much damage was inflicted on these nuclear sites?
Yeah, so that is a question. There's the energy question and then the nuclear question. As of now, satellite imagery suggests that, yes, there has been damage sustained at those sites, but unclear whether it's enough to permanently eliminate these stockpiles that Iran were sitting on. IAEA suggesting that there had been extensive additional damage at the Isfahan site. That was also the site that Israel had hit the week before, in Natanz as well. Again, extensively damaged. But then Ferdo, which of course is the one that everyone's been talking about because the stockpiles are buried deep underground, IAEA are saying it's not immediately possible to assess, in view of its underground location and the penetrating nature of the bombs used, how much damage has been sustained there. So the U.S. are framing this as a very successful attack and that the nuclear abilities have been eliminated. But time will tell whether that is true or not, particularly because the Iranians say that they had moved some of those stockpiles to other secret locations, and therefore they're still sitting on stockpiles, equipment, and the know-how should they want to restart the nuclear program once again.
So interesting, Jumana. Thank you so much. Of course, our top story today, Jumana Versace. Now let's take a look at the market reaction with Richard Clarida. He's Global Economic Advisor at PIMCO, former Vice Chairman of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Richard, thank you for joining us. What a day to have you on.
What a day.
We talk about inflation. There were worries this morning that the oil price went up to 100, and actually with that inflation and what that meant for treasuries. But the market's pretty calm. Are you surprised?
I'm pleasantly surprised. It's a good surprise. Yes, obviously historic events over the weekend. I think muted is the word with a capital M. Bonds flat, stocks flat to up, and the dollar a little bit weaker. So yes.
Is that because they can't price it in, or do you think this must have longer-term implication for treasuries or inflation?
Yes, I think Francine, I think everyone right now is waiting to see when and how Iran might retaliate. I'm certainly no expert on that, and I think the market will react once we have a better sense of that, and also a better sense of what the damage assessment is as well. So there's a lot that we really don't know right now.
Richard, I mean, in this environment, how should U.S. investors actually position themselves for U.S. rates?
Well, one of the things over the years, Francine, we've concluded at our forums is there's always an element of geopolitical risk in the world. You really can't go into the bunker and hide from it. You just have to adapt to it. And I think this is an example of that. You know, markets will try to look through and assess the fundamentals. I don't think you can get too caught up in the day-to-day volatility in times like this.
But do you worry? I mean, do you support, you know, the Fed has an idea that actually in the third quarter inflation is going to pick up. But there's always this mismatch between the surveys and actually translating into the real data. Will it come to fruition?
You know, we really don't know. So far, year to date, the inflation data in the U.S. has been coming in better than expected. Indeed, as of May, essentially inflation is running at the Fed's target. And so the Fed keeps waiting for the tariff impact to show up in inflation. That's in their forecast. That's in most other forecasts. But I think, honestly, we have to admit so far the U.S. inflation data has been coming in pretty favorably. Yeah.
Does that, I mean, the big worry is, of course, stagflation.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, we don't even pronounce it on a Monday morning in case something comes back. Do you worry about stagflation in the U.S.?
I think it's a risk. Now, if we do get a stagflation, it's not going to be the bad old days of the 70s with 10% inflation and bell bottoms and 12% unemployment, but we'll have a whiff, potentially a whiff of stagflation. Governor Waller recently of the Fed has indicated that he's prepared, and probably others on the committee, to really look through that if the economy's underlying fundamentals look sound. So an interesting next couple of meetings for the Fed, I think.
Yeah, where do you see the unemployment rate going?
Unemployment now is right where the Fed wants it to be, a very low unemployment rate, 4.2%. The Fed's baseline forecast has unemployment edging up. But again, a pleasant surprise so far in the labor market.
Richard, do you see a complete sea change since you were at the Fed because of all of the uncertainty in trade and tariffs, or is it just noise and the economy kind of like plods along?
Excellent point, Francine. The U.S. economy has really been remarkably resilient. There was the recession that never was in 22 and 2023. As I said, the inflation news has been better than expected. And I think all in that leads forecasters to have some degree of humility, probably appropriate.
I mean, I spend a lot of time talking about the BOJ and figuring out, you know, some of the market dynamics. I know that the BOJ and the Ministry of Finance really tried to soothe investors' nerves over the last couple of weeks. Do you think it's been enough?
Well, it's certainly gotten the BOJ's attention publicly. I think there is some evidence of some dislocation in the JGB market, which we view actually as an opportunity based on the fundamentals. And so, you know, there is a lot of JGB debt outstanding, and the BOJ is the major holder of that. So it creates an interesting market dynamic.
I mean, there's a big auction tomorrow. There's a 20-year auction in Japan. I mean, will that go okay? I think all bond investors in the world are holding their breath because it has global repercussions. It
will, and obviously the auctions in the U.S. are getting a lot of attention these days, too. I think I'll defer to my colleagues in Asia on the details on that. I've not been following the auctions in Japan.
But in the auctions in the U.S., is there, I mean, again, there's so worry about debts. Is this the first time where we start thinking actually how reliable is the U.S. in terms of, and treasuries?
The U.S. is going to pay off its debt, so that it's going to be reliable on that. Period. Exclamation point.
It's crazy that we have to remind everyone.
Well, it is, and obviously there is the downgrade, and the U.S. has about 100% of GDP of debt outstanding. That used to be a number that scared people. Many countries in the world now have numbers about that high. Look, Francine, the U.S. is on an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. Everyone, including Secretary Bessent, acknowledges that, Jay Powell. But the baseline view of PIMCO is Washington will keep kicking that can down the road probably until the next decade.
Is there a worry that one of the bond auction actually doesn't go? I mean, it goes very badly.
There's always a risk that an auction can go badly. We will not have a failed auction. The Treasury will be able to sell its debt. It may have to be selling it at a price that it doesn't like, but we're not going to have a failed Treasury auction. And actually, since the concerns began to be raised 6-8 weeks ago, most of the Treasury auctions have actually gone pretty well. So there are buyers for Treasuries.
Richard, I know you spend a lot of the time actually as a great student of history and trying to figure out the U.S. economy and what happens to it next. Like, what are we missing in the picture? Is there something on small companies, small and medium-sized companies that we should be paying a lot more attention to that don't have the buffer actually when it comes to trade wars and tariffs?
It's a great question, and one of the themes in our secular forum recently was we're in a world in which there are going to be, because of changes in government policy, industrial policy, trade policy, security alliances, there are going to be secular winners and losers at the company level, the sector level, the country level. So to us, it's an opportunity, but it means investors probably should shy away from just buying an index or a passive approach. We think it's an investment opportunity for active management.
Are we underestimating how the Trump administration is trying to change the fabric of American companies from within?
I don't think we're underestimating it. I think importantly, we have industrial policy in the U.S. It's some different industries than would have been the case had Harris been elected. More of a move to traditional as opposed to electric vehicles, drill baby drill as opposed to the green transition. Similarly in Europe, we've seen in Germany a pivoting towards the defense sector. And so I think industrial policy is part of the investment landscape. They have to focus on the industries that are favored.
And so what does it mean for PIMCO?
Well, as I've said, we think active management is going to thrive in this environment. We are in a world, we have been now for about a year or so, where yields have reset to a generational high level. That means fixed income investors can earn a decent, historically good return. Fixed income provides a good hedge against equity risk, and so a lot of opportunities out there.
Richard, how do you think about AI? I imagine AI, the fact that it transforms productivity, inflation, and just our economies at the core makes it, more difficult for central banks to try and suss out what happens.
Well, it does, Francine, especially over the relevant time frame. And, when you're Jay Powell, you're looking at the next 6 weeks, the next, maybe the next 12 months in Jay's case because his term is up. But, AI is going to play out over the economy over 5, 10, 15 years. I can make a case that 5 or 10 years from now, AI is going to be disinflationary. But I can also make a case that over the next year or two, it may push up inflation with all the building that needs to be done in terms of data centers and the like. It will also have very important distributional consequences.
Richard, you mentioned Jay Powell's term, will be up. How should we think about central bank independence under the Trump administration? Yeah,
well, I think on that score, we have some good news. The Supreme Court recently, in a case unrelated to the Fed, issued a ruling in which it said that, in essence, the Fed is different, and in particular, more or less indicates that the Supreme Court does not believe that a president can fire a Fed governor or a Fed chairman except for cause. And also, importantly, your viewers should understand that the Trump folks, including the president, have said that they have no intention of firing Jay Powell. And so we think he's going to serve out his term, which runs through May of next year.
Richard, as always, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Richard Clarida, their economic advisor at PIMCO, and of course, former vice chair of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Coming up, as NATO leaders prepare to meet after the U.S.'s unprecedented strikes on Iran, we'll discuss the security outlook with Rachel Ellehuus, Director General at RUSI. That's next, and this is Bloomberg. Now, EU foreign ministers meet today in Brussels ahead of a NATO summit in The Hague that President Trump is set to attend. Europe's reaction to America's airstrikes on Iran is likely, of course, to be a key focus. Oliver Crook joins us now. Ollie, good morning. So how are European powers responding to the airstrikes?
Yeah, Francine, what we're hearing from European leaders is what we're hearing, I think, broadly speaking, from all of the international community, which is basically this is the moment now for de-escalation. The solution to this conflict will not be won on the battlefield, but at the negotiating table. And that is something that we've heard, for the last sort of week or so, but that sort of has got a new urgency after the U.S. strikes over the weekend. I'll bring you a couple of the direct comments. I think it's worth mentioning also what the Russians have said over this is, of course, Iran, a strong ally of the Russians, where Russia has been getting a number of its drones and is waging its war against Ukraine. We heard from Dmitry Medvedev, who's the deputy head of Putin's Security Council, and he had said that actually several countries are now prepared to supply Tehran with nuclear weapons. We should say that Medvedev has been a sort of troll in chief by the Russians and been very articulate about kind of criticizing the West over the last few years, but also saying that the U.S. attack caused minimal damage to Tehran and is not going to stop them from seeking a nuclear weapon. We should also say that the Iranian foreign minister is in Moscow today and will be meeting with President Putin a little bit later. But again, we heard the similar things from Ursula von der Leyen from what we've heard the entire week, which is that Iran should never be permitted to reach a nuclear weapon. This is sort of tacit endorsement of what the United States has done. But we also heard from her tweet, and this is something that I think comes as a slight criticism of the United States, that there needs to be respect for international law, and that is absolutely critical. This is part of the critique that we've heard domestically within the United States and a little bit abroad, which is that was this a preemptive strike or was this a preventative strike? And the distinction between those two things is how imminent the threat of Iran getting a nuclear bomb is. There's been a lot of debate about that, and we're hearing that from the Europeans. We should say, Francine, we're here in The Hague. We're expecting Donald Trump to arrive tomorrow. The Hague is the home of the International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, really symbols of the international multilateral global order that Trump really wants to blow up. But we should also say, Francine, that the Europeans are going to have really limited influence over what goes on in the Middle East and certainly what goes on in U.S. foreign policy.
Oliver, thank you so much. Oliver Crook there at the NATO summit in The Hague. Now, Bloomberg will have interviews with senior European officials at the NATO summit this week, including the EU foreign policy, the chief Kaja Kallas, the German foreign minister, and the defense minister of Netherlands. Now, joining us is Rachel Ellehuus, Director General at Defense and Security think tank RUSI, and former European representative for the U.S. Defense Secretary. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us. I have a million questions on NATO spending, actually what we heard from Spain, but also the Middle East. First, does Europe have a place in trying to mitigate what's happening between Iran, Israel, and the U.S.?
I believe the Europeans tried in that intervening period where Donald Trump gave a 2-week notice to the Iranians that he expected them to come to the table and negotiate. You saw a flurry of diplomacy from European leaders. But, of course, the strikes have now put us in an entirely different place. So for Europeans, I think the focus is on force protection.
How are you expecting Iran to actually retaliate?
It's very difficult to say right now because they're probably making some internal calculations about how any retaliation plays on their economy, on regime survival. So I think we've really just got to wait and see.
Rachel, I want to talk about NATO spending, but first, what do we know about actually the nuclear program? I mean, it's still unclear exactly how advanced it was, and with the new strikes, whether you can even see how much damage there is.
Yes. In any strike like this, we have to wait for the battle damage assessment. We have to wait for things to clear to really figure out how much has been hit. And you can't take off the table the possibility that the Iranians knew this was coming and possibly move things to other sites. So dispersal is not a good thing.
When you look at the significance, of course, of the NATO summit and the fact that Donald Trump is expected to arrive in The Hague, first of all, there was an exemption that Spain got from the 5% spending target. This feels very significant to me.
It is very significant. And we should remind everyone that Spain already was not meeting the NATO criteria of spending 2% of GDP on defense. So first and foremost, this hurts Spain. But secondly, any sort of habit of opt-outs in a NATO alliance that operates on consensus and unity is not a good precedent to set. I imagine the discussions around that table were very tense, and Spain will be in the hot seat for quite a long time.
Do you think it actually also risks jeopardizing the bond that Europeans were trying to hold together in the face of Donald Trump?
Absolutely. I mean, when we talk about defense spending, it doesn't benefit just NATO. It also benefits each individual country as well as the European Union. So the money that Spain is not spending also undermines the EU's ability to do more in security and defense.
Rachel, we were together actually last week in Helsinki at a security conference, and one of the conversations was trying to figure out whether Europe had to just spend more to appease Donald Trump or whether it was to spend more to make sure that they could defend themselves. Is it a bit of both, or does Europe just have to stand on their own feet?
It's definitely the latter, that they have to do it because the strategic environment demands it. And if you look at the figures, the two big spikes in defense spending among European NATO allies come in 2014 and 2022. So the two Russian invasions of Ukraine. So it's no accident that people recognize what's going on. But when you're asking to go to 2, 2.5, even 3, there's some trade-offs there that are difficult to reconcile with what your public wants to spend on.
Yeah, and this feels also like a big deal, like a generational shift, right? What's the importance and significance of this NATO summit?
So this NATO summit is really a pattern of the last three. We had Madrid, we had Vilnius, we had Washington, and now we've got The Hague. And all of them were about reinforcing collective defense, making sure that NATO can deter Russia and other adversaries and defend itself if needed. And so this is about making sure that the plans and the capabilities that NATO has put forward to do that are properly resourced. And defense spending is one aspect of that, but outputs, concrete outputs, like some of the capabilities that Secretary General Rutte has mentioned, long-range strike, ammunition, all of those things matter as well to show that NATO is serious about fulfilling these objectives that it's set for itself.
Is the transatlantic relationship still solid?
You know, I've been surprised at the unity that the U.S. has shown in the run-up to the Hague summit. We haven't seen some of the worst-case scenario ideas that have been thrown out there. We haven't seen U.S. troop withdrawals from Europe. We haven't seen really no replacement of the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe. So some of those worst-case scenarios, I think people read too much into the politics. At the end of the day, I think the United States realizes that NATO is a good deal for U.S. security.
I mean, Rachel, when you look at the global security complex, is there a danger that actually we're focusing so much on Iran that we're forgetting, right, and that also leaders are forgetting about Russia, or forgetting about Gaza, and that something else could also happen further east?
Absolutely. I think it's worth reminding that President Trump came into office saying that he was going to get the United States out of wars overseas and, if anything, focus on the Indo-Pacific, and in fact has spent most of his time focused on the Middle East. So really there are competing tensions, and there's a limited amount of attention, capabilities, money that can be put towards each problem. So I do worry that with all the difficulties that are happening in the Middle East, that detracts attention and capabilities and resources from the Ukraine war.
Yeah, and without being alarmist, is this, how would China be looking at this?
They've been remarkably silent, and Russia was quite silent on the Iran-Israel issue for some time. Now I see a bit of opportunism. With China, it's a little bit different. I think they're probably worried about increasing energy prices. They're probably worried about instability in markets and how that could affect their own economy. So they could actually be a more tempered voice in trying to de-escalate.
But they wouldn't take advantage of the situation to actually do something in the South China Sea.
That probably seems like it would create even more chaos, both economically and politically. So I would assess that's highly unlikely.
Okay, Rachel, thank you so much for coming on today. That was Rachel Ellehuus, Director General of RUSI. Now, oil traders watching, of course, for any disruption in the Strait of Hormuz will dig into the potential impact on the crude price after the U.S. strikes on Iran. This is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. The world braces for Iran's response to the U.S. attacks on nuclear facilities. The Revolutionary Guard signals that U.S. military bases in the region could be targeted. Oil erases gains after hitting $80 a barrel. Traders watching for signs of disruption in the Strait of Hormuz. And global stocks waver amid the uncertainty, while airlines shares under pressure as carriers reroute away from the Middle East. Now, welcome back, everyone. The unprecedented U.S. airstrikes on Iran have set governments worldwide on edge as the Islamic Republic warns of retaliation and Israel shows no sign of letting up on the assault. Well, we're joined by Rosalind Matheson, REMEA News Director. Ros, thank you so much for being here this morning. There's a lot of speculation of what Iran can't do, how quickly it would do it. What are the options?
Well, there are quite a few options for Iran, but as you say, a lot of calculations of the pros and cons here, because you have to do something in response to the US striking you directly. But what is that response that sends a message, perhaps without, again, setting this into a further escalation and a broader conflict in the region? I mean, we saw previously, obviously, in the Trump administration earlier, where they took out a senior Iranian general, and in the reprisals, obviously, there was a message to the US: we're going to hit US bases in the region, but we're going to warn you beforehand so you can get out of the way. And so maybe there'll be some kind of action like that. Yep. Again, perhaps there'll be action through proxies, although Iran's proxies are quite weakened at the moment, including Hezbollah. Do they take the option of closing the Strait of Hormuz? Or that would be quite self-defeating for Iran economically. I mean, it's their main waterway also for the oil trade. So that could be damaging for Iran to do that. Do they go into the cyber realm? Because, of course, they've got a lot of experience at creative mischief in cyberspace with cyber warfare. So do they do some kind of action there? Is a collection of things. And it's obviously also about, again, for the regime in Iran, wanting to maintain preservation for themselves, but also show the Iranian people that they're standing up to the external threats. So a lot of calculations there. And so we might see Iran just taking a bit of a breath here to work out what to do.
Ross, what do we know about actually nuclear sites? I mean, Donald Trump says they were obliterated, but we don't know.
We really don't know. And the IAEA, the UN watchdog, is saying that they don't know. There's no signs of massive damage, at least for now. There's no signs of radiation leaks going on. And of course, there's no clarity on where the heck, 400 kilograms of A-grade uranium is. And that's really the question. They've lost track of the higher risk uranium and where it's gone in Iran. And has it been moved to different sites? Does that give Iran some options there as well? And so really understanding the damage to these sites is very difficult at this point, because is it short-term damage they can repair quickly? Is it long-term damage that's going to shut these sites down for a very long time, for years or more? Has it really denuded Iran's nuclear capability, or is it just going to accelerate it? But at this point, we just don't know.
Yeah, Roz, what's been the reaction, in the international community? I mean, some are saying, well, how can we lecture Russia if then the U.S. does this? But actually, there's not a lot of people that, think that Iran was not a threat.
Well, that's right. It's interesting to see the behaviour of countries after this. I mean, the Europeans seem really quite sidelined in it, and they're being very clear that they didn't take part in the US strikes. Does that create a risk in itself? Because Iran at least passed messages through the Europeans. Previously, there were back channels there. Do you miss some of the opportunity in the signalling and the messaging if Europe's cut out from the US on it? Equally, you've got Iran's allies, traditional allies, Russia, China, being quite clear that they're not going to come in and militarily support Iran in all of this. That's even as China's probably watching very carefully the flow of oil from the region, because it relies on it a lot. They're not keen to rush in either. So it really does seem at this point it's Israel, Iran and the US.
Ross, thank you so much. Ross Matheson there, REMEA News Director. Now, the U.S. has conducted strikes on Iran, as we were just saying, and we're waiting to see whether or not this will lead to an escalation in the conflict in the region. Joining us now is Sanam Vakil, Middle East and North Africa Program Director at Chatham House. Sanam, thank you for joining us. Where does this go next?
Well, we're very much in a wait-and-see moment. First of all, the Iranian leadership is assessing its options. There are not many good ones on the table. But secondly, it's important to note that the strikes back and forth, the war between Israel and Iran is also continuing. There has been no lull there. Iran is considering escalatory measures, whether it's leaving the non-proliferation treaty, stopping International Atomic Energy Agency cooperation. That would be relatively benign, but dangerous in its own way. Secondly, of course, there's the potential for a military response, striking U.S. air bases, potentially even those that have been evacuated, to send a signal, a face-saving solution. But Iran is certainly the weaker party here. It doesn't have too much in its toolkit left to protect the regime while preventing further escalation. So we have to see what Iran's supreme leader says. He is in a bunker. And so I think the system is very much trying to coordinate options.
Sanam, what's the way that Iran can still inflict pain on the U.S. and the rest of the world without damaging itself too much? Like, what are the calculations there?
Well, there aren't any that won't have a boomerang effect and impact Iran. But, most obviously it can hit U.S. military bases in Iraq or Syria. There's certainly a wide array of options in the Gulf. I don't think hitting targets in the Gulf is in Iran's interest at this moment, really because the Gulf states and Iran's relations with the Gulf states have been improved dramatically, and Gulf leaders are playing an important role in trying to de-escalate this conflict. Nobody wants this war to spread, and nobody wants this war to continue. And it's worthwhile also stating that Gulf leaders are very alarmed by the talk of regime change in Iran. While there's been no love lost between Iran's leaders and Gulf states in the past, there are deep concerns that this could have spillover effects impacting regional stability in very serious ways. Iran has, of course, also threatened for quite some time to close the Straits of Hormuz. That would impact, of course, Iran's economy. It would put pressure on Donald Trump, no less, but this is no easy feat. So, these are some of the potential options on the table. But again, there are a lot of risks for Iran here.
So, Sanam, how lonely is Iran, or how alone is Iran right now?
Iran is and has always felt alone. This goes back to the 1979 Iranian Revolution, which was very ideological and threatening for the Middle East. It has no natural allies in the region. And geopolitically, Iran is very isolated, obviously, from the United States with no diplomatic tensions. But there have been real deepening problems between Iran's ties with European countries as well. It has closer relations with Russia and China, both economic and strategic, but it appears that these geopolitical players aren't going to enter this conflict. Instead, they're making rhetorical calls for de-escalation, but probably seeing opportunities for their bilateral challenges with Washington. Russia, of course, looking to talk to President Trump and try to present an off-ramp, and China very much focused on its own dynamics with the Trump administration, so they're not going to wade in. Iran does have improved ties with its neighbors, though, and I don't think it wants to compromise those.
Sanam, when you look at the security in the world at large, how much is this also taking away from concerns of what's happening in Gaza, but also Russia? Is all of this the world leaders' attention now going to be on Iran?
Well, I think Western leaders and Western bureaucracies have been struggling with this issue of quote-unquote bandwidth for quite some time. We now have three major wars that Iran's war with Israel could also become a protracted conflict. There's no guarantee that it's going to quickly come to an end. Three protracted wars of attrition are very dangerous. And this, of course, has broader destabilizing effects geopolitically for the principles of international law. There are definitely some double standards playing out here. And I would say, above all, there are no real efforts to address Israel's ongoing pummeling of Gaza. There are a huge amount of deaths reported every day that are not getting the attention that they deserve. And I think that policymakers need to be able to walk and chew gum, particularly on Israel's aggression towards Palestine. You can be able to do both, and you can be able to be critical and supportive if that's the Western position in this conflict with Iran.
Yeah, and Sanam, finally, I mean, when you look at Saudi Arabia or some of the Gulf states, I know they have a vested interest when it comes to the oil price, but, how much will they weigh in on what's happening in the next couple of weeks?
I think they're very concerned. Gulf states have been very critical of Israel's strikes on Iran, have also been critical and called for de-escalation. They've held an Organization of Islamic Countries summit in Istanbul just on Friday. And Saudi Arabia actually condemned the U.S. strikes on Iran, which was quite striking. A statement coming from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And this speaks to the real anxiety percolating across the Gulf, worried that this is another 2003 moment for the Middle East, 2003 being when the U.S. invaded Iraq, and regional countries, including most of America's Arab allies, strongly opposed the U.S. invasion. Gulf states continue to bear the consequences of that invasion 2 decades onwards. These are very concerning times, and ultimately Gulf states, but Arab states more broadly, are very aware that Israel's military campaign against Iran is drawing attention away from the war in Gaza, and ultimately they do not want focus to be lost on the issue of Palestine, and they don't want to be pressured into normalizing with Israel without a guaranteed pathway for Palestinian statehood. And that needs to return to the conversation while we also follow the Israel-Iran war underway.
Sanam, thank you so much. Sanam Vakil, they are director of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House. Now, oil erasing earlier gains of as much as 5.7%. Crude initially jumping after the U.S. attacks on Iran stoked concerns that energy supplies from the Middle East could be disrupted. Now, as the world braces for Tehran's response, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has called on China to pressure Iran not to close the Strait of Hormuz. About a fifth of the world's crude output passes through the strait.
Well, I encourage the Chinese government in Beijing to call them about that, because they heavily depend on the Straits of Hormuz for their oil. If they do that, it'll be another terrible mistake. It's economic suicide for them if they do it. And we retain options to deal with that. But other countries should be looking at that as well. It would hurt other countries' economies a lot worse than ours.
With us now, Will Kennedy, our Senior Executive Editor for Energy and Commodities, and Al Nightingale, Team Leader for Oil Trading Europe. So thank you both for joining us. Well, what's oil doing? So it was up, but now it's pretty much flat. It's like, what, no concerns here? Move on?
Well, I don't think there are no concerns. I think the broader picture is that we're probably $10 a barrel up from where we were before Iran first struck Iran. So that risk premium remains in the market. But the immediate concern that the US attack would be followed by Iranian retaliation, possibly on the shipping industry, hasn't materialized. And the most important fact for oil traders looking at the market today is that oil is still flowing. Oil is still getting out of the Persian Gulf into global markets. We haven't seen that flow impeded in any material way. Therefore, after an initial jump, there's no need right now to mark the price higher.
So, Al, I mean, the concern is the Strait of Hormuz, right? Because it just passes so much. I mean, does Iran have any incentive to close it or to do something there? Because it would also inflict so much damage on their oil exports.
I don't think the risk is only the Strait of Hormuz. There's also kind of, say, Iraq or nearby countries where it could potentially look at their oil infrastructure. I agree with you about kind of the harm that they could do to themselves, but Iran is looking increasingly cornered, and when you're under that kind of pressure, is not completely certain what you'll do in response. So they may well do something that looks outwardly irrational, and they don't have to close the Strait of Hormuz. It's not as binary as that. They can do things that maybe add to the risk premium, as Will was talking about. Yeah,
so how do they do it? I mean, again, we're looking at some of the, the global energy checkpoints and that strait. I mean, could they close it partially? Is it bombing? Is it through something else? Could they disrupt it, just to cause a bit of chaos?
Well, I think that's it. There's every opportunity to calibrate the response or to do something that is less than a full closure. So, for example, you could order foreign ships into your territorial waters. You could make an effort to target American ships. Yep. Obviously, there's a potential for response, but I think just talking about the closure of the Strait of Hormuz probably isn't the right way to think about it. It would be very, very difficult to do that for any length of time. They might make some declarations. We saw kind of stuff in the Iranian parliament, but I think it has to go to a higher level before they take that step, and it's a huge step to take.
What does history tell us, Will? I mean, if we look at Kuwait, if we look at Iraq, is there any, template for this?
History tells us that eventually the oil gets to the market. If we look at the Iran-Iraq war, yes, there was a lot of harassment and attacks on oil tankers, but ultimately the oil got to market by using convoy systems, by getting navies involved. And, while a similar scenario would be very disruptive for markets, I think the US Navy would find a way to get the oil out of Hormuz. I don't think this idea that Iran could close Hormuz fully and permanently for any length of time is credible. As Al was saying, it's a sort of scale of interference, of disruption. But that's not to minimize things here. Hormuz is absolutely vital to the function of the global energy market. We're already seeing the cost of shipping in and out of the Persian Gulf rising, so it has had an impact. And I don't think that markets should be complacent. Clearly, Iran has some decisions to take, and things could change very quickly.
Yeah, and again, for people that are looking at home or on trading floors that don't know, basically the strait goes through the territorial waters of Iran and Oman, right? At some point, the strait is actually quite narrow. It's like less than a mile or just over a mile.
No. Sorry, at its narrowest point, it's something like 21 miles. But
21 miles.
That's still very narrow. If you think about what the Houthis did in the Red Sea, they managed to bring down traffic by something like 70% compared with 2022 and 2023, and they're attacking a vast stretch of water, 21 miles in width when you've got a land border. That's a lot smaller than what the Houthis did. And, if you do see incidents involving shipping, we have to see what owners' risk tolerances are. As Will was saying, in the Iran-Iraq war, you got over 400 tankers attacked, but the oil flowed. So ultimately, you get to a point where people have to make decisions. They have to decide how they feel about risk. There are so many things that can happen from now to, an escalation or an increase of tensions.
Yeah, and we saw, I think, 2 supertankers actually turn around. Will, thank you so much. Al, thank you so much. Will Kennedy and Al Nightingale. Now, coming up, Israel reacts to U.S. strikes on Iran and ratchets up attacks of its own. More on that next, and this is Bloomberg. The U.S. attacks on Iran have been welcomed across the political spectrum in Israel, but the Israeli president has said the attacks do not mean the U.S. is joining the war against Iran.
We made clear throughout that we are not dragging America into a war, and we are leaving it to the decision of the head of, the president of the United States and his team, because it had to do with America's national security interest, period.
Well, we're now joined by Bloomberg's Dan Williams in Jerusalem. So, Dan, what remains for Israel to tackle in Iran is what exactly? Its nuclear program has been obliterated by the U.S. airstrike, as President Trump has said.
Hello. Well, yes, that really is the question of the day, because the Israeli attacks are continuing apace. So is the Iranian retaliation. On a smaller scale, perhaps, but it seems that the Iranians are titrating what remain of their missiles. Today, for example, we had 4 separate launches, one of just 1 missile, the other 3 of around 5 each time. But the last 3 managed basically to shut down the country for 30 or 40 minutes while everyone took shelter. So it seems the Iranians are being resourceful, imaginative with how they use their remaining arsenal. And the Israelis, meanwhile, have been attacking, including in Tehran last night. So I think the distinction here, and it's a distinction with a difference, is a dispute potentially brewing quietly, respectfully, with much circumspection over the damage that was in fact dealt to those 3 sites attacked yesterday by the United States, specifically the one at Fordow, which was out of reach for the Israeli military, given it was so heavily defended, dug into a mountain, and required the heavy bombs of the United States. As you noted, the president, his defense secretary have both spoken in absolute terms of the destruction of the Iranian nuclear program. The Israelis have been saying, well, certainly a lot of damage was dealt, but until the BDA, the battle damage assessment, is in hand, and that could take several days, it will be impossible to know for sure exactly how much of those sites may remain, specifically the one in Fordow.
So, Dan, how might this all impact the war in Gaza?
The war in Gaza continues. It's now well into its 20th month. to judge from what the Prime Minister Netanyahu said in a press briefing yesterday evening, which was televised, he believes Israel could actually have advantages in Gaza should Iran be bested, should Iran be defeated in this round of confrontations with Israel. His logic, as he applied it, was Hamas is an Iranian proxy. Having lost its sponsor, having seen its other allies like Hezbollah not rising to its defense, the Hamas leadership may decide to cut a deal with the Israelis to surrender, hand over what hostages remain in exchange for, say, an exile deal. However, he himself acknowledged that this has yet to, quote unquote, sink in with Hamas. So it would appear that that war will continue, albeit not as headline grabbing as the current war with Iran.
Dan, thank you so much. Dan Williams there for us in Jerusalem. Now, European airline stocks under pressure this morning as airlines, including British Airways, cancel flights to the Middle East. Let's get more from Bloomberg's aviation reporter, Danny Lee. So, Danny, good morning. What's been the impact on airline stocks?
Well, for airlines, they are very sensitive to the higher cost of oil, particularly through the jet fuel prices. So this is why you see the share prices of airlines being put under pressure, not just in Europe, but earlier in the day in Asia as well. And it's through the high cost of oil, which means it's more expensive for the airlines through operating costs, but also because what we see, not just the threat in the sea, but also in the air, where airlines are having to take longer routings potentially, that they are factoring higher cost overall into their operations.
So talk us through the airlines actually rerouting and cancelling. Who are they and what's the new route?
So we've seen so far the likes of Singapore Airlines in this region of the world cancelling flights between Singapore and Dubai up until July 25th. We've also seen in Europe British Airways take action since the weekend. That also presents a challenge in as much as for various airlines, they're taking a various range of options. We've not seen the likes of Qatar Airways or Dubai, or Emirates Airlines taking similar action. They still remain business as usual for the large part, but it's for the foreign airlines coming into the Middle East region. They are more worried about the risk to their operations if planes get stuck as well. So airlines are taking various different approaches, but clearly for airlines confronting this growing escalation in the Middle East region, there is a fact to be played out in terms of how they are having to take the risks to their operations.
And Afghan airspace, now busier than ever, Danny.
Yeah, it is going to be busier than ever because of the narrowing number of ways in which airlines can fly through the region. So it's between Iran and through Jordan to Israel, which is pretty much locked out for airlines. And so they are squeezing into a fewer spaces. But it remains to be seen, though, is if this escalation in the war grows ever deeper, how many fewer options airlines have. And that's something that the airline industry will be watching out for.
Danny, thank you so much. Danny Lee there with the very latest on flights. Now, we're live at the NATO summit this week, speaking to key players, including the Dutch defense minister, the foreign ministers from Germany and Lithuania. Up next, Bloomberg Brief, and this is Bloomberg.